I want to speak today, not as a president, not as a soldier, not as a man of power, but as a human being standing before truth. Because there comes a moment in every leader's life when the noise of the world fades and a terrifying silence appears. A silence where reality speaks louder than guns, louder than titles, louder than crowds. And in that silence, I began to understand something that shook me to my core. Something many fear to discuss, something many mock, something many pretend is myth, yet something that the prophets warned us about with clarity and urgency. And that is the reality of Dajjal, because when you strip away politics, when you strip away borders, when you strip away race and ideology, you realize that Dajjal is not just a future figure. He is a system of deception, a trial of perception, a storm of lies designed to make falsehood look like truth and truth look like weakness. And I say this honestly. What shocked me was not that Dajjal will come, but how prepared the world already is to accept him. How trained humanity has become to worship illusion, comfort, control, and power. How easily people surrender their conscience in exchange for safety, entertainment, and approval. And I looked around at our world and I saw signs that matched the warnings perfectly. A world where truth is censored and lies are amplified, where morality is mocked and corruption is normalized, where faith is labeled backward and arrogance is celebrated as intelligence. And I asked myself, how did we arrive here? And the answer frightened me, because we arrived here slowly, step by step, compromise by compromise, until deception no longer looks dangerous. It looks normal. And that is the greatest weapon of Dajjal, not force, not violence, but confusion. Because when people no longer know what is right, they will follow anything that promises order. And when people are spiritually empty, they will worship anything that feeds their ego. And I began to understand why the prophet warned us that Dajjal would come with false paradise and false hell. Because today paradise is marketed as unlimited desire, and hell is presented as discipline and restraint. Obedience to Allah is portrayed as oppression, and rebellion against Him is sold as freedom. And this inversion of reality is not accidental, it is preparation. Because Dajjal does not arrive in a world of strong faith. He arrives in a world already weakened by distraction, arrogance, and forgetfulness. And I looked at leadership across the globe, including myself, and I asked a painful question. Are we leading people toward truth, or are we entertaining them into sleep? Because leadership without moral grounding becomes a tool of deception, and power without accountability becomes a pathway for Dajjal's system to thrive. And what truly shocked me was realizing that Dajjal does not need to convince everyone. He only needs enough people to surrender their thinking, enough people to trade principles for comfort, enough people to silence their doubts for social approval. And suddenly, falsehood becomes dominant, not because it is stronger, but because truth stands alone. And I began to reflect deeply on the tests described. The false miracles, the control over resources, the manipulation of hunger and fear. And I realized that even today, food is used as a weapon, debt is used as a leash, media is used as a mirror that distorts reality, and technology is used not just to connect, but to control perception. And none of this shocked me individually. What shocked me was how perfectly it aligns with the prophetic warnings, as if history itself is marching toward that moment. And I say this with humility. If a leader does not understand this, he will unknowingly serve it, because Dajjal does not neigh. Add loyalty, he needs compliance, and compliance comes from fear, ignorance, and dependence. And this is why faith terrifies tyrannical systems, because faith creates people who cannot be owned, who cannot be bought, who cannot be silenced by hunger or threats, because their hearts are anchored beyond this world. And when I understood this, I realized why the greatest protection against Dajjal is not weapons, not wealth, not alliances, but clarity of belief, remembrance of Allah, discipline of the soul, and courage to stand alone when deception surrounds you. And I understood why the prophet emphasized certain verses, certain prayers, certain awareness. Because Dajjal attacks perception first. And if perception collapses, morality follows. And if morality collapses, civilization collapses quietly. Without war, without explosions, just slow decay. And I looked at how people now argue about everything except truth. How outrage replaces wisdom. How noise replaces reflection. And I saw humanity distracted exactly at the moment it needs awareness. And that realization disturbed me deeply. because it means Dajjal's greatest victory would not be his arrival, but humanity's readiness to welcome him. And I refuse to be a leader who ignores this reality, because leadership is not about winning elections or battles. It is about preparing people for trials greater than ourselves. And if I cannot speak truth when it is uncomfortable, then I have already failed. And I say this clearly: Dajjal will not come announcing himself as evil. He will come promising solutions, unity, prosperity, and peace. And those who have already abandoned truth will see him as salvation, while those anchored in faith will see him as the greatest deception. And that is why this reality shocked me, because it exposed how fragile modern confidence truly is, how easily pride replaces humility, how quickly people mock what they do not understand, and how desperately the world needs leaders who fear Allah more than they fear losing power, because without that fear we are not leading. We are drifting, and drifting societies are the easiest to deceive. And as I stand here reflecting on this reality, I remind myself and anyone listening that the greatest resistance to Dajjal is not hatred, not paranoia, but awareness, discipline, and unwavering commitment to truth, because deception thrives in ignorance, and truth survives in hearts that refuse to bow to illusion. And this understanding has changed the way I see power, responsibility, and the future. Because the real battle ahead is not territorial, it is spiritual, not loud but subtle, not immediate but inevitable. And only those who prepare their hearts will recognize it when it arrives. And I want this continuation to flow without a single break, because reality itself does not pause, and the deception does not pause. And the responsibility on those who understand does not pause either, because once your eyes are opened, you cannot pretend you did not see. And once your heart recognizes truth, you cannot live comfortably with silence. And I realize that the most dangerous phase of Dajjal's reality is not his final appearance, but the conditioning that comes before it, the slow erosion of values, the normalization of injustice, the rebranding of oppression as progress, the rewriting of morality to suit power. And I began to see how people are trained to laugh at sacred things while defending what destroys them, how faith is reduced to a private hobby, while corruption is defended as realism. And this is why Dajjal's deception will feel familiar, because the world is already rehearsing for it, already practicing surrender without chains, already celebrating illusion without questioning its cost. And I reflected deeply on how fear is used as currency: fear of poverty, fear of isolation, fear of being labeled backward, fear of standing alone. And I understood that fear is the gateway through which deception enters, because a fearful heart seeks shelter anywhere, even inside a lie. And this is why courage rooted in faith is the greatest threat to falsehood, because a believer who trusts Allah is already free, already unchained, already immune to the promises of false paradise. And I say this clearly: what shocked me was realizing how many powerful institutions operate on the same principles that Dajjal represents: control without accountability, knowledge without wisdom, progress without morality, and influence without responsibility. And when these systems dominate, people begin to believe that survival requires compromise, that dignity is negotiable, that truth is flexible, and that is the exact mindset Dajjal requires to rule, not with armies, but with acceptance. And I looked at how young minds are shaped today, flooded with images, overwhelmed with noise, deprived of silence, deprived of reflection, deprived of remembrance. And I realized that a distracted generation is the easiest to deceive, because when the heart is constantly entertained, it never has time to recognize emptiness. And emptiness is where truth often begins. And this understanding weighed heavily on me as a leader, because leadership is not about controlling people, it is about protecting their clarity. And clarity is the first casualty of deception. And I asked myself, if Dajjal appeared tomorrow, how many would recognize him not by his appearance, but by his ideology, by his message, by the subtle shift he brings that prioritizes comfort over conscience? And this question disturbed me deeply, because it means preparation is not external. It is internal, not political, but spiritual, not collective slogans, but personal. Discipline. And I realized why the Prophet emphasized knowledge paired with humility, because knowledge without humility becomes arrogance. And arrogance is blindness disguised as confidence. And Dajjal thrives in arrogance, because arrogance convinces people they cannot be deceived. And that illusion alone is enough to trap them. And I reflected on how often people say it cannot happen to us, forgetting that every fallen civilization once believed the same. And this is why remembrance of Allah is not ritual, it is resistance. Because remembrance anchors reality beyond illusion, beyond propaganda, beyond fear, and when hearts remember Allah, deception loses its grip. And I say this from deep reflection, the greatest danger is not that Dajjal will lie, but that people will want his lie to be true, because it excuses their desires, justifies their compromises, and removes accountability. And this realization shook me more than any battlefield ever could, because battles end, but deception reshapes generations. And I understood that a leader who ignores this reality is not neutral, he is negligent, because silence in the face of deception is participation, and neutrality in times of moral trial is alignment with falsehood. And I refuse to carry that weight, because leadership before Allah is not measured by applause, but by intention and action. And I remind myself constantly that Dajjal's greatest test is not belief versus disbelief, but sincerity versus convenience, truth versus comfort, discipline versus desire. And these battles happen quietly, inside hearts, long before they happen in the world. And this is why I speak, because warning is not fear-mongering, it is mercy, and awareness is not extremism, it is responsibility. And as I continue to reflect on this reality, I see clearly that the world is not ending suddenly. It is unraveling slowly, thread by thread, value by value, until people forget what they were meant to protect. And when that happens, deception does not need to force entry. It is invited, celebrated, defended. And I pray that Allah grants us clarity in a time of confusion, courage in a time of fear, discipline in a time of excess, and humility in a time of arrogance. Because only then will we recognize falsehood no matter how beautifully it is presented, and only then will we stand firm when illusion demands submission. And this understanding has transformed the way I see the future, not with panic, not with despair, but with responsibility. Because trials are not meant to destroy believers, they are meant to reveal them. And deception is not meant to conquer truth, it is meant to expose who truly holds on to it. And as I carry this awareness forward, I know that preparation is ongoing. Vigilance is constant, and faith is the anchor that no deception can uproot, no matter how powerful, no matter how convincing, no matter how widespread it becomes. And as this awareness settled deeper within me, I began to understand that the greatest illusion of our time is the belief that neutrality is safety, that silence is wisdom, that staying comfortable is intelligence. Because in times of great deception, comfort is often the reward for surrender. And I saw how entire societies are trained to avoid discomfort at all costs, to escape difficult questions, to mock seriousness, to laugh away accountability. And this culture of avoidance is fertile ground for the reality of Dajjal to grow, because when people no longer want truth if it challenges them, they will gladly accept lies that flatter them. And I reflected on how easily strength is confused with cruelty, how leadership is confused with domination, how success is measured by control rather than service. And this inversion of values is not random, it is preparation. Because Dajjal represents power without mercy, intelligence without wisdom, authority without accountability, and a world that already admires these traits will not resist him. It will celebrate him, and that realization struck me with a weight I had never felt before, because it means the battle is not waiting for the future, it is happening now, quietly, in classrooms, in media, in conversations, in the way children are taught what to admire and what to ridicule. And I realized that the most effective deception is not the one that hides truth, but the one that replaces it with something that feels easier, more attractive, more convenient. And I saw how patience is mocked, restraint is shamed, humility is labeled weakness, while arrogance is branded as confidence. And this psychological conditioning prepares hearts to reject guidance when it finally matters most. And I asked myself how many people would recognize Dajjal not because of his signs, but because of the emptiness his message carries beneath its beauty. And that question terrified me, because it means recognition requires depth, and depth is something the modern world actively discourages, replacing it with speed, noise, and endless stimulation. And I understood why the Prophet warned that people would follow Dajjal knowing he is false, because deception does not always succeed through ignorance. Sometimes it succeeds through desire, because people choose what benefits them even when they know it is wrong. And that realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about leadership, that leaders who feed desires instead of discipline are not protecting people, they are weakening them. and weakness invites deception. And this is why I believe that the greatest responsibility